Thank you very much, Jim. So oh, there you go, there's the slides. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for those of you who are attending live for giving up your lunch hour to come to this talk. So I'm Ben, and together with Cairan, we'll be presenting on how sound and noise fit within the indoor environmental quality agenda. And the slight change from what Jim mentioned, we merged our two presentations. So we're going to be switching, it's one presentation, we're going to be switching between ourselves. There's a bit of a lag when I'm, yeah, there we go. So here's the overview of the session for today. Going to start with the big picture, which is indoor environmental quality and ventilation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, or give an overview of what we know about the health effects of sound and noise, and then how sound and noise fit within the indoor environment, with ventilation being a key link. And then Cairan will be talking about ventilation in the indoor environment, and he will provide an overview of his current research. And then I'll do some concluding remarks. So if we're thinking about the big picture, we couldn't think of a better way of presenting it than the system map developed for this network, the Future Urban Ventilation Network. It's really a great way how to visualize what is a rather complex problem. So in terms of our talk today, so Cairan will start by talking a little bit about the relationship between indoor environment and health outcomes. And then I'm going to focus on how sound and noise, both outdoor and indoor, fit within the indoor and outdoor environments. And then Cairan will talk about how ventilation, building ventilation characteristic, link into the outdoor and indoor sound problem. And weaving along the way will bring up issues of health inequalities in terms of like demographics and vulnerability. So over to Cairan to give a brief overview of indoor environmental quality and health.
Great, thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. Just going to get this out of the way. So Europeans spend most of our time indoors. Some parts of the population spend almost all of their time indoors. And during the COVID pandemic and national lockdowns, large populations have been spending almost all of our time indoors and most of our time at home. The indoor environment is comprised of 4 component parts: thermal, acoustic, visual, and air quality. Whilst we spend time indoors, we are exposed to these components, and these components have the potential to affect our health and well-being. First, I'll discuss the thermal environment, where exposure to high and low temperatures can affect our health. Low temperatures affect the human body's cardiovascular and respiratory systems and can lead to death in humans. There are an estimated 41,000 excess winter deaths in the UK during 2014, and these are expected to reduce by 2% by 2050 due to the effects of climate change. Exposure to high temperatures can cause heat stress, heat strain, and heat stroke. There are an estimated 2,000 deaths due to high temperatures in the UK during 2014, and these are estimated to rise by 257% by 2050, again due to the effects of climate change. Indoor air quality is a broad term, and it encompasses chemical and particulate pollutants that are present in the indoor air. Exposure to these pollutants can result in a wide range of health and well-being issues in human beings, but the main issues are to the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Some components of indoor air quality can also have an indirect impact on our health. For example, humidity can affect mold growth, and mold can impact the human respiratory systems. There are an estimated 3.8 million deaths every year around the world due to indoor pollutants, 99,000 of which are in Europe, and exposure to particulate matter is the leading risk factor for disease in Europe. Exposure to noise can affect health and well-being in many different and complex ways. I'm going to pass over to Ben now, who's going to discuss the links between noise and health in some more detail.
Thanks, Cairan. So yeah, the focus of this session is on sound and noise. So going to spend a little bit more detail on this specific aspect. So how does sound impact health? So we have a number of pathways. The first one is a sort of a direct pathway, autonomous physiological reactions. So these are your body reactions to sound without you being aware of. It's predominantly at night in the form of sleep disturbance. And I'll talk a bit more on that in a minute. There's another pathway, keeping in mind that sound is a sense. We hear, we perceive sound, and it has meaning. So, and if sound is perceived as positive, it can lead to psychological restoration. Think about, for example, a nice green space, quiet place. If the sound is perceived in a negative way, then according to the transactional stress model, you have this constant cycle of appraisal, reappraisal, coping sort of in your head about, do you appraise the sound in a negative way, what sort of coping mechanisms you have to deal with it, and then you do a reappraisal. And we know that if you have acute effects on health over a long period, those can translate into chronic outcomes. There's another kind of, you could say, complication or another mechanism, which is influence on behaviors. So the sound environment outside your home might influence how likely you are, for example, to go out for a jog or to go out to visit a green space. Or more relevant perhaps to this network, it could influence your ventilation practices. And then I can't talk about sound and health without referencing non-acoustic factors. These are contextual factors where kind of like it's nothing to do with the dBs or the sound level itself. It's the context in which the sound is happening, for example, time of day. And you may be wondering how we know all this. So if we look at sleep disturbance, in the past 20 years, we've had some very good quality studies where they measure sleep disturbance in people's homes, not in labs, using polysomnography, which is considered the gold standard of how you measure sleep disturbance. And that involves measuring brain activity, eye movement, and muscle tone. And what you get from that is what's called the hypnogram. So on the x-axis, you have time. Here it's showing an 8-hour nighttime period. And on the y-axis, you have different stages of sleep. W is awake, REM sleep, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, which are different stages of sleep. So 1, 2 is light sleep, and 3 and 4 is deep sleep. And experts believe that REM sleep and deep sleep are the most important aspects for the restorative benefits of sleep. So if we map this is for a young, healthy adult. Start from awake, and then they go very quickly into deep sleep. But you will notice that we don't go into deep sleep and stay there throughout the whole night. There's transitioning through the different stages. And you will see generally you have more deep sleep in the beginning of the night and more REM sleep at the end of the night. So what happens when you introduce noise? So this is an hour during the night from 3 to 4 o'clock. The diamonds are noise events, in this case, aircraft flyovers. And you will see that in the hypnogram, which is above that, this person was in light sleep. A noise event took place. It took them momentarily to awake and then back to light sleep. Then they went to deep sleep, but right at that moment, there was another noise event which took them to wake. And then more importantly, they didn't go back to deep sleep. They went to light sleep. And then for the third noise event, you will see that there's no reaction. And that's quite important. Not every single noise event wakes you up. So this process continues, and it's called sleep fragmentation. On the top, you will also see that from a cardiac perspective, the heart rate, there's always a momentarily increase in heart rate for every single noise event. I mentioned that we know a lot about how noise affects sleep. We definitely do. However, there's still a lot of unknowns. And one of them is we observe quite a bit of difference across individuals. So this is showing the hypnogram throughout the night for a sensitive and noise sensitive person and a noise resilient person. And you will see that there's a much higher degree of fragmentation for the noise sensitive person. So this is kind of like links into the sort of inequalities vulnerability aspect. And what do we do with all this information? We use them in terms of exposure response relationships, where you can get the probability that a noise event leads to an awakening based on the noise level. But the important thing is this is one of the very few health outcomes which are related to an indoor level as opposed to outdoors. So these graphs are in terms of the maximum indoor sound pressure level. In terms of the other pathway, so we discussed this, the direct pathway, we have noise. So you're sitting at home, you came back home after a stressful day of work, you're trying to relax, but noise from outside is disturbing your activities. That leads to a cognitive and emotional response. And the way your body deals with that is by the release of stress hormones. And over time, that could trigger increases in blood pressure, blood viscosity, etc., which are known risk factors for cardiometabolic diseases. And if you're interested in this area, I really recommend this review published this year by Thomas Munsell, which gives quite a comprehensive summary of the mechanistic evidence we have to date on this. If we look at epidemiological evidence, hopefully some of you will be aware that the WHO Europe published updated guidelines in 2018, which is quite a useful summary of the evidence. But for those of you who are familiar with systematic reviews, they take time to produce. So guidelines published in 2018, they are based on evidence up to roughly 2015. So now we have 7 years of newer evidence, which is not captured in those guidelines. And I've just included 3 here, which are either systematic reviews or good quality studies showing links with diabetes, with dementia, and with stroke. And if we look at how this evidence gives us useful information, we have relative risks expressed in terms of a long-term noise average, LDEN, which is a 24-hour composite metric based normally on annual average traffic flows. And more importantly, this is noise outside the dwelling. So the question then arises, if you have 2 dwellings, one of them with very good triple glazing and good quality, quiet mechanical ventilation, and the next door is relying on natural ventilation, the dose inside will be very different. So that could be clouding the results a bit. So there's an increasing interest in this, but there's only very few studies. And this is one of the few I'm aware of where they looked at outdoor, but also indoor. And the way they looked at indoor is they took into account the orientation of the living room and the bedroom. Is it facing the busy road in front of the house? And then at the back, there's perhaps a quiet garden. They also took into account facade insulation and ventilation behaviors. And the results are very interesting. So for the most adjusted model, hopefully you will see that M2, if you compare the outdoor and indoor relative risks, they are roughly the same. It's 10% increased risk. But the difference is in the confidence intervals. Basically, if you use the indoor levels, then your results become statistically significant. And we anticipate that this is going to lead to an increase in taking into account ventilation practices in future research like this. That evidence is primarily based on transport noise sources, but as we know, there's other sources of noise. Neighbors is an important one. We often think of neighbor noise as coming through the walls, but neighbor noise can come from outside. Construction, industrial activities, mechanical services, power generation, leisure facilities, etc. And of course, if we're talking about noise sources, I can't not mention Morris, France's most famous rooster. Just a reminder that it's not always that rural is quiet and urban is noisy. And so we can talk a lot about noise and sound, but the purpose of this session is people don't have only sound in their lives. So if you consider a dwelling, yes, you may have railway or a road outside your dwelling, but you also have sources of overheating, you have sources of indoor air quality, and that's how people live in everyday life. And then we need to bring in climate change, which Cairan already mentioned. And climate change and climate change adaptation is important in this context for two reasons. We're seeing new sources of sound or noise. For example, for power, we have onshore wind, and for heating and cooling, we have heat pumps. But also climate change adaptation is changing the way we insulate our homes and the way we ventilate our homes. And Cairan is now going to take over to look specifically at the relationship between ventilation and indoor environmental quality.
So ventilation by opening windows is the main way for occupants in Europe to impact or change their indoor environment. Ventilating can improve, but it can also worsen the indoor environment. And our exposure to high or low temperatures, different pollutants, and indeed noise, as Ben's just been talking about. Ventilation modifies our exposure to these pollutants, and so ventilation can have an indirect impact on health. Ventilation can be defined as the removal of stale, polluted, or warm air from inside and replacing this with fresh, unpolluted, or cooler air from outside. In the UK and in Europe, natural ventilation is the dominant form of ventilation, and that's where we have trickle vents, extract fans in our bathrooms and kitchens, and by opening windows. Next, I'll introduce the relationship between ventilation, overheating, indoor air quality, and noise. So there is general agreement between the theory, modeling studies, and the limited empirical research considering the relationship between ventilation and overheating. These studies generally show that when the outdoor air temperature is lower than the indoor temperature, higher air exchange rates will reduce the indoor temperature and reduce the risk of overheating. Not all empirical research has found this relationship, as it is often difficult to disentangle the cause and effect of overheating. There's limited empirical research considering overheating in the UK, and a lack of research considering the relationship between occupant behaviour and building overheating. The current empirical research lacks measurements of air exchange rates, has small sample sizes, and lacks measurements of other aspects of indoor environmental quality. Furthermore, overheating is typically considered in isolation of the other aspects of the indoor environment. Conlon and Harvey Clark illustrated a real-life example of where facade sound insulation was considered separately from the provisions for ventilation and mitigating overheating. It's a really interesting piece of work, which I urge you to have a look at if you're not aware of it. They reviewed 160 major planning applications in London and found of those 85% of the planning noise assessments assumed windows or closed windows, and the overheating assessment assumed openable windows. This leaves the occupants with a choice between thermal comfort or reasonable indoor noise, but not both. With urbanization, the urban heat island effect, more airtight buildings, and the changing climate, this problem is likely to worsen. The Association of Noise Consultants has produced the Acoustics, Ventilation and Overheating Residential Design Guide. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's referred to as the AVO guide. This guide recommends an approach to acoustic assessment that takes regard of these interdependent factors. I've put a reference up on the slide for you to have a look at. The literature describes that when there's an air exchange set up between indoors and outdoors, for example, when opening windows or operating ventilation systems, indoor concentrations of pollutants from indoor sources, such as carbon dioxide and volatile organic compounds, will be reduced by dilution or removal. However, indoor concentrations of outdoor pollutants, such as particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide, will increase. Conversely, occupants might not want to open their windows due to outdoor noise, as we've talked about, air pollution, security, or for many other reasons. In this case, low air exchange rates will result in higher concentrations of pollutants from indoor sources and lower concentrations of pollutants from outdoor sources. Closing the windows can also cause overheating, as previously discussed. Noise can be generated by ventilation equipment itself. And this is a common reason for occupants disabling, blocking, or turning ventilation systems off. Turning off purpose-provided ventilation systems can compromise the thermal and air quality of the indoor environment, which can allow temperatures and pollutants from indoor sources to rise to potentially dangerous levels. Outdoor environmental noise is regularly cited as a barrier to occupants opening the windows in pursuit of improving indoor air quality or reducing overheating. This is shown through a really interesting and large research project by Anderson et al., where he studied 933 participants and found environmental noise to be a significant predictor of when the window was open. They also found that dwellings which perceived the indoor air quality as bad, more windows were open in dwellings that perceived the environmental noise as quiet. This is important as it shows that despite perceived poor indoor air quality, occupants did not have open windows, which could be because they perceived the outdoor environment as noisy. To wrap this up, most of the literature reports that occupant behaviour is one of the most important factors for ventilation, air exchange rates, and overall indoor environmental quality. Another really interesting piece of research by Becker et al. Looked at 500 Danish bedrooms and constructed different regression models. The takeaway from this research is they found that occupant behaviour was a far stronger predictor of ventilation rate than building characteristics alone. The authors, as I mentioned, built different regression models with building characteristics and behavioural variables, and found that the behavioral model was able to describe 30% of variation in air exchange rates and the building characteristics, only 9%. The reasons why people open the windows and the barriers to opening the windows are vast, and research frequently describes that ventilation behavior is very different between people. Some people ventilate when carrying out a specific activity, such as showering or cooking, others at specific times of the day. Others react to their perception of temperature or air quality. Ventilation is also shown to be influenced by the type or use of the room that the occupant's in, the building design, occupants' knowledge of ventilation, occupants' knowledge of their own ventilation systems and how to work them, noise from the ventilation system, noise outdoors, security, outdoor air quality, household size, occupant age, and there are more. This large number of driving factors and barriers make ventilation research complex and challenging. Despite the literature emphasizing the importance of occupant behavior on ventilation and indoor environmental quality, there's a lack of empirical evidence and research on the relationship between occupant behavior and indoor environmental quality. Furthermore, I've touched on this before, temperature, indoor air quality and noise are often studied individually and rarely with ventilation together. This is a problem, as we've discussed, when ventilating, one component of the indoor environment might improve when ventilating, but to the detriment of another. This really highlights the importance of studying all these factors together and to relate it to health impacts. I'm going to introduce my research project in this slide. So the aim of the research is to investigate the relationship between occupant ventilation practices and indoor environmental quality factors, including overheating, indoor air quality, and noise, and to relate this to health thresholds and guidance. This research will be employing an empirical approach, responding to the lack of empirical data. It will be using mixed methods, so collecting both quantitative physical measurements of indoor environmental quality and qualitative social data on the household and their ventilation practices. Mixed methods approach is important as buildings are complex socio-technical systems, and much of the behavior we're interested in is enacted by the occupants. So it's important to collect qualitative social data from the occupants. Finally, I'll be studying this phenomenon using a multi-case study approach where the complex interaction of all the factors we've been talking about can be carefully explored. So, how am I doing this? This research uses a range of specialist equipment for collecting the data on indoor environmental quality from 7 case study dwellings in the UK, measurements of temperature, humidity, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, PM1, PM2.5, PM10, total VOCs, noise, and window and door vents throughout each case study are also being recorded. This results in a large complex data set with high temporal and spatial resolution. The noise equipment, which you see in the photograph on the bottom right of this slide, is noise equipment that was developed mostly by Ben and a little bit of help from myself. It's based on a small single board computer with 2 microphones, which measures noise indoors and outdoors simultaneously. The design of this equipment was optimized to be unobtrusive for the participants as possible, so that it could work effectively and efficiently for long-term monitoring campaigns. So it's unobtrusive from a physical perspective, it's small, and It's also, it has no displays, no lights, and no sounders. So it's something which quite quickly falls into the background of the participants' homes. It can be easily installed by the participants themselves. Importantly, the outdoor microphone can be installed irrespective of what floor they live on. With some of these specialist off-the-shelf equipment, it's not very easily to locate outdoor microphones. But in this case, we developed an outdoor microphone with a little sucker cup, so it can be easily installed on any floor. And finally, and very importantly, it gives very careful consideration to ethical and privacy concerns around collecting this type of data. One major limitation of using event sensors for detecting whether a window or door is open or closed is they do not easily allow for jar positions to be measured. The sensors themselves can be expensive, they can be intrusive, and I have had numerous problems with using these in real dwellings. So this led us to develop a new novel or a new method for inferring window positions. So the open, closed, but most importantly also that ajar position from sound measurements taken inside and outside of a window and door. So we've tested this method in 2 very different case studies, and the method is achieving very high accuracies. The photo that you see on the right-hand side shows an example of us testing this method with 2 very different noise measurement systems. It's actually showing the noise measurement system we developed alongside a specialist off-the-shelf measurement platform. And the method was developed, and we used the equipment to demonstrate that the method can be successfully used with any type of measurement platform. So we're in the final stages of writing this into a paper, which will be published shortly. When this has been published, we hope to return and talk to you all a bit more about the method in detail and explain exactly what it's all about. So COVID and its implications on the monitoring work. COVID presented quite a unique challenge to the monitoring campaign, particularly with the amount of equipment that we use. So where normally I would install and manage the complex equipment myself, the pandemic and lockdowns meant that this was not possible. And so I had to redesign the monitoring campaign. So we initiated and managed the whole monitoring campaign across all 7 case study dwellings entirely remotely, using the postal system and modern communications apps to talk through installation, fault finding, and fixing any problems. As you can imagine, remote campaigns came with loads of different challenges, not least using non-experts to install highly specialized equipment. Some important lessons we learned were around the importance of communication, supporting the participants, and really simplifying the installation and management of the equipment as much as we possibly could. So we hope our experiences from carrying out a really complex and thorough monitoring campaign entirely remotely can be used to facilitate future campaigns of this type. I find this really exciting, as I think the lessons that we've learned from carrying out this type of remote work and the rapidly reducing cost of equipment, the evolution of the Internet of Things could unlock larger campaigns with larger sample sizes and possibly lower overall costs. So unlocking a whole new horizon of research in this area. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the analysis that we're carrying out. uses 3 novel analysis strategies to disentangle the complex relationship between ventilation and IEQ. The end result is relating ventilation as a practice to each component of indoor environmental quality together. This is work in progress, and for that reason, I can't give you lots of details, but I hope to again return later next year, if possible, to share more about these strategies and some of the initial results. The results of the research can be used to support other evidence for policy change and for reducing uncertainty in modelling work. It can be used to provide public health guidance on ventilation, with the ultimate aim of reducing their exposure to pollutants, reducing healthcare costs, and the impact on society as a whole.
Sorry, I've lost my mute. I lost my mute, but I do apologize. So yes, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm just going to sort of summarize into 4 sort of take-home messages. And the first one is, if indoor environmental quality was a big jigsaw, hopefully we've convinced you that noise is a key piece. It's a key piece both because of the noise and sound affecting health, but also in terms of noise as a behavioral modifier for ventilation practices, which will have a knock-on effect on other aspects of indoor environmental quality. The second one is linking to the occupant. So as Cairan has mentioned, the occupant behaviour has a much more significant influence on ventilation than building characteristics. So we think it's really important that we start bridging the gap between building performance design intent and building performance in use. The third point is, unfortunately, due to time, I talked a lot about noise. I didn't talk much about sound, and sound can have positive or health benefits. And there's a very increasing amount of research focus on the practice of soundscapes. And if we try to apply that to what we discussed today, could we envisage a situation where we can design the outdoor sound environment to promote healthy ventilation behavior, where the sound environment outside your dwelling really encourages you to open your window to let the nice sounds in, but you're ventilating obviously your dwelling at the same time. And the final point also made by Cairan is that instrumentation is rapidly developing. With sound here because of the focus of the talk, but this applies really to the broader picture. So with Internet of Things, with smart sensors, it's really opening new opportunities where we can look in more detail in complex problems like we have here with indoor environmental quality and occupant behaviors. We hope you found this session interesting, and we'll be more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Cairan. That's excellent. It's hard to know where to start to pick up on some of these points. You've certainly convinced me of the merits of looking at noise in more detail and in a more integrated way. And with your research, Cairan, it's really impressive to see what's coming out of it already in terms of things that can be applied usefully elsewhere. whilst people perhaps think about any questions they have and drop them into the chat for you both, I guess taking a step back, thinking about the bigger picture in terms of indoor environmental quality and health. Maybe this is unfair, but my sense is that noise is often recognised as a relevant factor, but the discussion might be more typically dominated by discussions of ventilation in the context of air quality. And I know this is a big and potentially something that could take a very long time to answer, question to ask. But how would you say we could maybe, if that premise is true, how could we potentially better address noise and indoor air quality and other factors together as determinants of health, rather than this separate approach that you've brought up? And are there any kind of quick wins or easy wins that you can see, either from your position, Ben, or maybe in a more applied way in your research, Cairan?
If I go first, Cairan, and then feel free to join in. So yeah, thank you very much, Jim. That's a very, very good question. And first of all, I don't think it's unfair at all in saying that kind of like noise, unfortunately, comes often as an afterthought. I think that's partly historical in terms of the evidence on the health effects of sound and noise sort of lags the larger evidence we have for air quality. Some people unfortunately still see as noise as a nuisance and nothing else. So I think that's partly due to that. And it's kind of like, I think networks such as this one will have a very important role in education. So when people realize, yes, oh, I didn't realize the evidence, it has evolved so much for sound and noise. So I'm going to think about it. If we think in terms of quick wins, that's where it gets quite tricky, because you might think, okay, can we have a composite metric, for example, which includes everything? But then it leads to oversimplification. And if I can still change progress one, I tried to, in terms of metrics, just for sound, I came up with more than 30 in terms of like instantaneous or long-term average, whether they consider all the frequencies or specific frequencies, in terms of statistical metrics, how sort of the L1 considers the top 1% of sound. So even just for sound, just using one metric is oversimplifying. And that's before you go into the merits of sound quality. And then you have an equal number, but larger number for indoor air quality. I don't know if for temperature is simpler, but it's when you try to go on a composite metrics, you're trying to simplify things. So yes, they can be useful in sort of a mindset that I have these quadrants, which Cairan showed, I have to consider all 4 quadrants. But when you try to come with kind of like, okay, I came up with a single metric which covers everything, there's invariably going to be oversimplification, which may be suitable for some high-level decisions, but needs to be untangled later on. And Cairan, feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, I can share a little bit on this. So I have in my research attempted to use a composite metric so what this metric does, it's quite a well publicized metric which looks at the concentration of a pollutant relative to its exposure limit value. It's been used in some recent papers. And what you can do is look at a period of time which is relevant to a ventilation event, and look at the maximum value of that ratio. And one of the things that I've been able to find is it's quite challenging using these composite metrics, because when Ventilating, what I'm finding at the moment is that some aspects of the indoor environment improve, and then perhaps some aspects do not, and they worsen. So a good example of this is that for many of my case study dwellings, these homes are located in noisy environments. So what happens is when they have a buildup of pollutants indoors from indoor sources, and they decide to ventilate, the indoor air quality might improve and indoor temperatures might reduce in the summertime, but noise worsens. So when you're looking at a single value which represents all of these components, those nuances are hidden. So yeah, so the initial findings I'm having are that a composite metric is quite difficult to identify what's actually really happening at a more granular level. So just really, that's, again, I'd love to talk more about this when I have more concrete results. I've only flexed 4 case studies at the moment, so I've got another 3 to work through, but that's what I'm finding at the moment.
Thanks both. And whilst we've been speaking, I think we have a few questions in the chat from some of the attendees. So hopefully you can both see those. So we pick up the first one there from Bernard about COVID passports for buildings rather than imposing restrictions on individuals. Yeah, I'm not sure if we can relate that back to the noise and ventilation side. I guess a kind of wider question on that is does your sort of work, or does the noise side, has that been considered, Ben, in terms of advice to the public for buildings and ventilation? Or is it the case that when you have something that poses an imminent risk to health, that tends to be the focus, and noise is in the background? Or is it being considered at the moment as a behavioural factor perhaps that is relevant to people's exposures?
Sorry, which question? I'm got a bit lost. Which question are we trying to address?
If we scroll up to the top, so Bernard's question was about whether we should be encouraging government to insist on COVID passports for buildings rather than imposing the restriction on individuals. I'm trying to relate that back to the presentations and the kind of role of considering noise and trade-offs against other aspects of indoor air quality. And I was wondering to what extent noise has been or is being considered in terms of controls and building passports and COVID restrictions.
Well, I can't comment on COVID passports. I think that's a much broader discussion, way beyond noise. I mean, obviously there are controls of noise for building, same as for other things. Perhaps one of the restrictions is, like Cairan mentioned, they tend to be taken in isolation. So Cairan referenced the study by Jack Harvey Clark, who I see is on the call, looking at kind of like planning applications where they considered overheating assessments and noise assessments separate, and they're expecting windows occupants to have to trade off. So I think that's where we need to work harder. And the other thing is factoring in kind of like, okay, you can design the best building, the perfect building with nobody inside it. But like we said, what happens when you put people, and some might argue, well, you can never know what people will do. Well, that's true. But in the end, if we are serious about health outcomes, then we have to take the challenge on board.
And it's Jack, in fact, that has the next question. I think this might relate to your research, Cairan, about finding out how we can design buildings that enable people to live in dwellings that are exposed to higher than preferred external noises, and approaches that are intuitive there, and what methods might be trialled in research or in your research.
So to answer Jack's question directly, we're not going to be looking at any attenuated natural ventilation explicitly as part of the work that I'm doing at the moment. It will hopefully form part, hopefully what I'm doing here will form catalyst of something that can be taken on to form a much larger project in the future to explore these types of things. What I'm trying to do at the moment is just focus on what we know to be the most common ventilation types and really focusing in on what happens to the indoor environment when people ventilate. Yeah.
And if I just may add, I think the other thing perhaps is hopefully Cairan's research will provide not a blueprint perhaps, of course there will be room for improvement, but it will demonstrate that you can do this complex research where you look at a lot of different factors and then where you can choose to investigate the impact of attenuating natural ventilation, etc., when you're monitoring not just noise, but also temperature, indoor pollutants, etc.
The next question from Kate is a wider question about pollution and inequalities and vulnerability, and whether you're aware of any research that looks at noise pollution outdoors or preferably indoors and how it varies with social disadvantage. We know about the links with outdoor indoor air quality, perhaps, and links with deprivation and related measures. Does that hold true for noise?
So there is some evidence there. It's definitely kind of like nowhere near what we would like it to be at, but I think in summary, it depends. I often like to quote, there's two studies, one in London, one in Bradford, and in Bradford, the researchers saw very much a relationship with higher noise exposure outdoors for those who are socially disadvantaged. For the London situation, it varied by noise source. So for example, for aviation noise, it affected more people who are on a lower social disadvantage scale. So you can't kind of like make sweeping statements. You have to see your kind of like particular location, particular situation. But of course, it's a very important question because you have then to add not just the noise, but the other pollutants, other social stresses, etc. So it is a very important question.
I'd like to highlight one really important piece of recent research which has been done by a colleague of mine. Her name is Lauren Ferguson. She's also doing some work with the UKHSA. And she has done exactly this, but with particulate matter. So she was investigating how different social groups might be disproportionately exposed to particulate matter. It's worth looking it up. Her name's Lauren Ferguson.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions, and we might have time for a couple more before we get to 1 o'clock. The next one was from David, who was asking about the level of research into, or perhaps the extent to which your research reflects whether external noise levels in the AVO guide are being met in practice, and the effects of external noise on decisions to sleep with windows open or closed. Have you got any insights into that from your findings so far, Cairan?
Can I just, if I may start first, I don't necessarily agree that it's a simple binary selection. We can break the nighttime period kind of like beginning, kind of like middle and end. And I don't think that people kind of like necessarily make simple binary selections. Perhaps you have a noise source which starts at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning, but in the beginning of the night, it's relatively quiet. So you might kind of like have to wake up in the middle of the night then to close windows. In terms of like the question on the AVO guides, I mean, Cairan can elaborate, but I think we're still discussing kind of what sort of guidelines he's going to be using to compare it, but Cairan, feel free to elaborate. And then the last bit in terms of who guidelines for nighttime noise LMAX are very low. They're probably referring to the most recent guidelines don't refer to LMAX, but they may be referring to the night noise guidelines. But I think even then, there's no guidelines for LMAX specifically. But what they may mean is kind of like, we know that health effects, so sleep disturbance, starts at very low levels. And yes, absolutely right, they are exceeded in many locations. But as I mentioned, not every single noise event is going to wake you up. So you can do a probability statistical exercise where you can take into account the level of the noise events, the number of noise events, and end up with an assessment of how likely that your situation is going to be harmful to health. And in terms of like they are very low, well, I like to use the analogy of for air quality. The guidelines for air quality, people can argue they are very low. It shouldn't kind of like be a very, okay, so we'll forget about them. It's just a challenge. And yes, we're not going to achieve them perhaps tomorrow, but it just should give us a driver for kind of like trying to find out more and find effective solutions.
I can't add anything more to that. I think Ben summarized perfectly. There are lots of very interesting noise metrics to look at around ventilation, and I am looking at a number of them, not quite sure. So I've done lots of core analysis, and these are the sorts of interesting other bits which I'm starting to work on as well.
I'm trying not to be too triggered by you, Ben, because of course I want to sort of get on my get on the high, well, not the high, I'll get onto the podium with this one, because it always strikes me that although we set standards for some exposures, there may be no threshold. So even when they do appear to be relatively small, there can still be an associated health burden and benefits in lowering exposure. But I've already done it, so I shall stop myself there, and we're over time. So I think the last messages from attendees are thanking you both, and I reiterate that, as Nick says there at the end, really useful work, and we look forward to the findings. And it will be great to have you both back in due course to hear more about this in future. So on behalf of the network and everyone that's attended today in the wider group, thank you for your time and this webinar. And I think all that remains is for me to hope that everyone dialing in has enjoyed today, and wish you all the best, season's greetings, and a great end to the year and into the new year for you and your families, and for the Breathing City Network in 2022.